So we are here at the 2017 NCAA convention with Val Ackerman, Commissioner of the Big East Conference. And we have a couple of different discussions that we want to have with you on conversation on the topic of strategic communication with constituents. And in particular, we're interested in how do you manage, you were the commissioner of a major conference that's been extremely successful in just about every sport over the last couple of years. How are you making sure that you are working in unity with all the CEOs that you have in your conference?
It's critically important, and there's no one tactic to do it. We do it through a combination of, nothing surprising here, I'm sure, email communication, meetings. We have a regular sequence of meetings over the course of the year like many conferences do, and we sort of mix and match groups. So for example, our board meets twice a year in joint session with our athletics directors. One of those is around the time of our men's basketball tournament, so it's a truncated meeting, and I think the minds of some of them are elsewhere because it's on the front end of the tournament and they're thinking about that. But that's 2 meetings a year. We do a third meeting a year where it's just the presidents themselves, which they wanted to have that time. And then for the rest of the constituent groups, we have phone calls, conference calls, in-person meetings. Most leagues have a so-called summer meeting where they would gather some combination of ADs, SWAs. In our case, it's those 2 groups plus men's and women's basketball coaches. So there's you can make a lot of headway with technology, but at some level there's no substitute for the in-person communications. There's where my mind is this time of year. And then finally, it's just one-on-one. If there are particular issues you have to deal with presidents on, you would call them one-on-one. I have an executive committee at the Big East chaired right now by Father Brian Shanley of Providence College. So I would deal with that group as a subset of the fuller board on occasion, particularly as we get ready for full board meetings. So it's kind of various tactics that you use, and it is important, I think, particularly because you are dealing with so many constituent groups in college athletics, to stay as in touch with the interests and needs of your base as you possibly can.
I'm interested in those actual board meetings and how you structure the meetings. With that number of leaders in one place at one time, how do you keep it from not going off the rails on a specific topic? Or do you have to let it go where the conversation takes it and what becomes maybe most important that maybe you didn't expect? How do you think through strategically structuring the meeting? It's
a little bit of both, Matt, and these are good points because we tend to have ambitious agendas for our board meetings, probably not unlike other leagues. We have specific notice requirements that we have to give to our board members in advance of meetings. We have to call for agenda items by a certain amount of time out. Then we have to get them the agenda before a certain time before the meeting so they have adequate time to review and to prepare. We send out written materials, an agenda plus a supplement. And one of the things that I do before every board meeting is I actually sit down and I try to plot out how much time I can afford to take on a particular item.
Right.
And the answer to your question is sometimes you have to let things go on longer than you budgeted because the group is really interested in that, or maybe you brought in a guest speaker and you only gave them 15 minutes or 20 minutes, but then you're getting a lot of questions, so you let it go 30. But then you kind of look at your watch and you're wondering, okay, now I got to make up lost time with this item. You have to build in the breaks because people don't want to sit without a break for 4 or 5 hours. You have lunch and so on. So it is a combination of trying to structure it out and following the needs of time, the time that you have, but also being a bit flexible so that if there is something they're interested in, they have time to deal with it.
This might be a really micro question, but do you strategically seat people according to whatever you're trying to accomplish or whatever it may be? Do you strategically seat people?
I don't know if she can answer that because she's going to give it away.
Well, it's a good question. We actually, only to a point. So what we typically have is a hollow square when we do our meetings. And the constituents at a typical board meeting for the Big East would be, again, in the case of joint meeting with our ADs, which is 2 of our 3 meetings. We would seat at the front of the table, myself and then our executive committee, which is made up of 3 presidents. So it would usually be sort of me, my board chair, my vice chair, and then the third. And then on either side of them would be their ADs. And then sort of down the down the stems of the table, so to speak, you would have the other presidents, and they would sit with their ADs. We don't mix and match ADs and presidents. So a president would get to sit with their person. And then typically what we do is at the back of the room, we would have the 6 or 7 conference senior staff members who would come to the meetings, and they're the subject matter experts. And in some cases, they present, certainly there to answer questions if they come up, but I tend to put them in the back of the room. And that pretty much fills up the space. And then when we have guest speakers come in, they kind of wait outside till it's their turn. Then we bring them in, try to do it around a break so it's, the flow's better. And then they would leave typically after they're done. They don't obviously get to sit around and listen to other business. So that's kind of how we would structure that. And then if it's the board by themselves, we tend to do that in our offices. We have a smaller space there. We sort of go outside our office for that joint meeting. And then we just let the presidents sit where they want. But we tend to put them at one end of the room, and we put our staff at the other.
Interesting.
If you're ever nearing consensus in a situation, do you have somebody that maybe intentionally plays devil's advocate? How do you make sure that you are absolutely certain in the decisions that you're making and that you're looking at everything from every possible perspective?
I think to get to consensus, the best practice is to do your work in advance. So you go into the room and you know who's for, who's against. As I mentioned, we have an executive committee of the Big East, and if there was ever to be an important item up for vote, we would work it through that committee and lean on the board chair in particular if we knew it was something that there might be divergent views on, and have that person make calls. It isn't just me, but I would, if it was particularly important, I might have the board chair do a president-to-president outreach there. So that's how we would do it. As I said, I think the pre-work would help you know what you've got in the room, and then you can kind of structure the conversation accordingly if you want to get a particular result.
Did you ever have a situation that you thought it was going to go in one direction, and then maybe were a little bit blindsided and it became a lot more contentious than you originally had planned it to be?
I've not had that yet in a voting situation, but I will say we have had some dialogue and some issues within the conference where I wasn't sure what to expect, and certain folks said things that surprised me, but they were in sort of discussion stages. It wasn't ever at the point where it was sort of teed up for a vote. And I think typically what happens, I've seen in our league, is if the winds are blowing in one direction and there's one president who is opposed, they tend to come around at the end if they sense that it's better to be unanimous. And so it's very cordial in that way. We haven't seen much contentiousness within the Big East, and maybe that's in part a reflection of our new composition, which is with schools that are very common. The old Big East, I'm told, I wasn't part of it, there were very divergent interests between the football schools and the basketball schools, who sometimes didn't even meet. They would get to certain parts of the agenda and they'd split up. You had big publics and small privates, and we don't have that in the Big East anymore. So I would describe our group as very collegial, really in line in terms of their thinking and what they think is important. So the kind of contentiousness that you might have heard about elsewhere, we haven't seen yet in the Big East, knock on wood.
Yeah, and you mentioned the makeup of the league, because I was curious if, now we've been a couple years since the recreation of it, and if the dynamics of decision-making as a group have changed at all, because maybe there was this honeymoon period at first where we were so excited about this dynamic group of schools we put together that are so like-minded, and if that's, if over time maybe that wears it all, but it sounds like maybe it hasn't.
Hasn't hit yet, Matt.
Yeah.
I mean, you never know, can't crystal ball that, but I would say our schools really are lined up on the priority sports. For us, it's basketball, not surprisingly. But I would, if we had to identify a next sport, for us it'd be soccer, kind of the football we don't have. The fall sport, we've had some strength there on both the men's and the women's side. So our schools are lined up on that one. And then I would say team sports generally they're lined up on, but it's the athletic piece, it's the academic piece. We do really well. I think we're second only to the Patriot League this year in GSR over the 6-year cohort. The values of our schools are common, in part because of the Catholic mission. And in order to sort of seal this, adding to that, all of that, was we just came out of a strategic planning process where everyone was forced to think about what can we all do together? What is important as a group to the conference? And so we have a 6-pillar plan. We've got goals. At the president meeting in June this year, we'll go through that and see how we did against the plan. Some of the tactics are in the hands of the schools. For example, postseason progression. Others are in the hands of the conference office in terms of, for example, budget management and what we can do to ensure a certain level of distribution back to our schools. Some of it is sort of hard to measure. How are we doing in branding and sort of other visibility goals? Sometimes they're hard to sort of metric out. But the strategic plan, I think, has been one way to make sure that we are as lined up as possible. So then people have differing views about how we get there, or the plan shifts because the majority went the other way on a particular goal or a strategy. I think we have a mechanism to manage that.
So at the time of this airing, men's basketball is at a really high level of competition. No reason to think that will drop off this season or any season in the future. As you think back to when you guys created the league, strategic planning for that sport specifically, what would you point to as why we are here today with, I don't know, you had 4 in the top 15 RPI last week? I mean, a significant level of competition that's happening in the Big East right now, against national comparisons too, right?
Well, I credit the presidents most of all because they, before I even came on, were the ones that wanted to do that, pull away from the old conference in the case of the 7, add Butler, Xavier, Creighton, all of whom have brought so much, particularly this last year, but not just this year, to the conference. So there was a decision made possible by their vision, by the coincidence of Fox starting the new network and needing the programming. So that enabled the presidents to say, okay, we may be leaving ESPN behind, but we have another partner who can give us visibility, credibility, and importantly, revenue. Mm-hmm. So that was an important piece. The ability to keep the name and the ability to play in the Garden were all keys. And that created, I think, a level of optimism that this was doable. Did you know for sure? No. Mm-hmm. But that was it. And then in basketball, the coaches, I would say, were very determined, particularly people like Jay Wright and John Thompson III. They were very outspoken about this not being the new Big East. It was just the Big East. And they were so sure, that it was going to be possible to keep this history of success going, and a little indignant when people didn't think that was going to happen. It was very interesting. But of course, who knew? And so I would credit sort of all these pieces that were in place before I even took this position, and that was the vision of the presidents, the TV piece, which is so important for exposure and recruiting these capable coaches that we have, and the ability to do it the right way. Jay Wright graduates 100% of his players, mm-hmm. and so that's probably the proudest point for Villanova.
I want to close with, I'm really interested in how football staffs are growing around the nation. And given your experience at the NBA and WNBA, there's significant support staffs for many organizations in those leagues. Are those needed in college basketball? Are there ancillary positions that we need in college basketball to give coaches more time to recruit and let analysts handle some game planning? What do you think?
Well, I look at I sit on the sidelines, and sometimes when there's a huddle, I kind of count who's not in a uniform. And it seems like a lot of guys to me, not so many women out there, and that's another story. Might we be able to have some women coaching men's basketball? Why not, I say. So hopefully that can happen. But I think there's a limit on how many people you really need. Mm-hmm. I don't know what the number is. And yet, you raise an important point. I think as technology evolves, that could be an area where you need particular expertise. Mm-hmm. I think all of the schools, whether it's football programs, basketball programs now, are trying to understand what the technology is, how it affects athletic performance, what you really need, and then when you have all this data, what you do with it. So do you need to hire a new person to decipher the report that you just got because cameras were installed on the ceilings and we're tracking player movement? Mm-hmm. What does all that mean from a staffing standpoint? And I don't know the answer to that one, but I don't think growing the personnel pool is, particularly with player rosters only being what they are. The NBA has the money to do it and can sort of afford the 1-to-1 ratio. I'm not sure you need that in college basketball.
Awesome.
Yeah, great discussion. Thank you for joining us today.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Val.
Great being here.